September 18, 1954, at 2:13 p.m., inside a beat-up 1942 Lincoln Continental parked outside the Louisiana Hayride Auditorium in Shreveport. The temperature gauge read 93 degrees, but inside that car, a 19-year-old truck driver was sweating like it was 120. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the steering wheel, knuckles white from gripping it like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to earth. The pomade-slicked hair he'd spent 45 minutes perfecting that morning was already starting to come undone, black strands falling across his forehead as he tried to steady his breathing. Elvis Aaron Presley had exactly $3.72 in his pocket. He'd counted it 4 times that morning, not because he needed to buy anything, but because the repetitive action of touching those coins gave him something real to focus on. His mama had pressed his one good shirt the night before, staying up until 11:47 p.m. to make sure every crease was perfect. That shirt was now soaked through with nervous sweat, clinging to his skinny frame like wet paper. He'd driven 243 miles from Memphis, stopping only once for gas that cost him nearly half of what he had. The audition was supposed to start at 2:30 p.m., but he'd arrived 2 hours early, too anxious to sit still at home. For the past hour and 17 minutes, he'd been running through the 3 songs he planned to perform, his voice cracking on the high notes every third attempt. His throat felt like sandpaper. His legs wouldn't stop bouncing. The dream that had consumed him since he was 11 years old was about to be judged by people who actually knew what they were doing. Inside that auditorium sat Horace Logan, the program director who'd been running the Louisiana Hayride for 6 years. Logan was what they called a kingmaker in the business, 42 years old, gray at the temples, with the kind of authority that came from launching the careers of Hank Williams and Jim Reeves. He'd seen 1,000 young men with guitars walk through those doors, each one convinced they were different, special, destined for greatness. Logan had developed a sixth sense for talent, or so everyone said. His word could open doors or slam them shut forever. He kept a silver pocket watch that he'd check exactly every 4 minutes during auditions, a habit that terrified every performer who noticed it. Elvis finally forced himself out of the car at 2:24 p.m., his legs feeling like they were made of water. The walk to the stage door was 73 steps. He counted every one. Logan was sitting in the 5th row center seat, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Elvis's father made in 2 months. His assistant, a severe-looking woman named Margaret Whitfield, sat to his right with a clipboard and a fountain pen that she held like a weapon. Logan didn't look up when Elvis walked onto the stage. He was writing something in a leather-bound notebook, his expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. When he finally raised his eyes, they were cold, calculating, already dismissive. "You've got 4 minutes, Logan said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Name and what you're going to sing." Elvis's voice came out as barely a whisper. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Elvis Presley, sir, I'll be singing Blue Moon of Kentucky." Logan's eyebrow raised slightly. "Bluegrass, that's your opener." "Well, sir, I do it a little different." "Different?" Logan repeated the word like it tasted bad. "Son, different doesn't sell records. Different doesn't fill seats. Different is what amateurs do when they can't do it right." Elvis started to play. His hands were still shaking, but the moment his fingers hit those strings, something shifted. The traditional waltz time of Bill Monroe's original transformed into something else entirely, a driving, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his gut. His hips started moving just slightly, unconsciously, like his body couldn't help but respond to the beat he was creating. Logan's pen stopped moving. Margaret Whitfield's mouth fell open slightly. Elvis's voice, when it came, was unlike anything that had ever graced that stage, part country, part something else entirely, something raw and primal that seemed to bypass the brain and go straight to the spine. But Logan's face didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. When Elvis finished, the silence in the auditorium was absolute. Logan stood up, his movement deliberate, calculated. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing like judgment itself, until he was standing directly in front of the stage, looking up at this sweating, trembling boy with his second-hand guitar and his desperate hope. "Let me tell you something, Elvis," Logan said, and the use of his first name felt like condescension rather than familiarity. "I've been in this business since before you were born. I've seen every type of act there is, and what you're doing up there, that hip-shaking, that, whatever you call that sound, it's not music, it's noise. It's the kind of thing that might impress teenagers at a high school dance, but this is professional entertainment." Elvis's face was burning now, the red starting at his collar and spreading upward like fire. His jaw tightened, the muscle there twitching visibly. Logan continued, each word precise, devastating. "You're too different to be commercially viable. You don't fit into any box that exists in this industry. Country fans won't accept you because you're corrupting their music. Pop fans won't take you seriously with that gyration. And rhythm and blues, son, that's not your world and never will be." He pulled out his silver pocket watch, checked it with theatrical deliberation. "My advice, stick to truck driving, at least that's honest work. This," he gestured at Elvis, still standing on the stage with his guitar hanging like a dead weight. This is a waste of everyone's time, including yours. Margaret Whitfield was already gathering her things, the dismissal clear. Logan turned to walk away, then stopped, delivered his final blow over his shoulder. You want to know the truth? You're not just unpolished or inexperienced, you're unmarketable. No record label in their right mind would touch what you're doing. And even if they did, radio stations would never play it. You're too much, too different, too wrong for what music is supposed to be. The clicking of Logan's shoes on the hardwood floor as he left seemed to echo forever. Margaret Whitfield followed, her clipboard clutched to her chest, avoiding eye contact with Elvis entirely. The stage door slammed shut at exactly 2:38 p.m. The audition had lasted 6 minutes. The destruction of a dream had taken less than 2. Elvis stood on that stage for another full minute, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. His legs were shaking worse now than they had been before the audition. The guitar felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. When he finally walked off the stage, his footsteps were unsteady, like a man leaving his own funeral. The parking lot was nearly empty when Elvis stumbled back to his Lincoln Continental. The sun was brutal, reflecting off the asphalt in waves that made everything shimmer like a mirage. He managed to get the door open, collapsed into the driver's seat, and that's when it hit him. Really hit him. The tears started as a burning in his eyes that he tried to blink away. But once the first one fell, the dam broke entirely. Elvis Aaron Presley, 19 years old, future king of rock and roll, sat in that sweltering car and cried for nearly 2 hours. Not the silent, dignified tears of a man trying to hold it together, but the raw, gasping sobs of someone watching their dreams crumble into dust. Every word Logan had said played on repeat in his mind. Unmarketable, too different, stick to truck driving. Each phrase was like a fresh wound, salt poured directly onto exposed nerves. He thought about his mama waiting at home, probably already starting dinner, ready to ask him how it went with that bright, hopeful smile of hers. He thought about his daddy, who'd called him foolish for even trying, who'd said music was for people who couldn't do real work. Maybe Vernon had been right all along. The crying came in waves. Just when Elvis thought he was done, another memory would surface. All those nights practicing in his room until his fingers bled, all the times he'd told anyone who'd listen that he was going to be somebody, all the dreams of seeing his name in lights, and the tears would start again. His shirt was soaked through now, not just with sweat but with the salt of absolute despair. He punched the steering wheel once, the horn blaring briefly in the empty lot. His knuckles split, a small line of blood appearing, but he didn't care. The physical pain was nothing compared to the hollowing out he felt inside, like someone had reached into his chest and removed something vital. At 4:47 p.m., an elderly security guard knocked on his window, asked if he was all right. Elvis couldn't even answer, just nodded and waved him away. By 5:15 p.m., the tears had finally stopped, replaced by something else. Elvis sat in that car, his face blotchy and swollen, his eyes bloodshot, and felt something shifting inside him. The sorrow was transforming, crystallizing into something harder, sharper. It wasn't quite anger, it was something more dangerous than that. It was conviction. The parking lot was casting long shadows now, the sun starting its descent toward the horizon. Elvis wiped his face with the back of his hand, tasted salt and determination. Logan's words were still there, but they were changing shape, becoming something else. Too different. The phrase repeated in his mind, but now it sounded less like condemnation and more like a challenge. He thought about his mama then, really thought about her. Gladys Love Presley, who'd never had much but had given him everything. She'd told him something when he was 14, right after he'd been laughed off stage at a school talent show. They'd been sitting on the front porch of their little house in Tupelo, the crickets singing their evening song, and she'd taken his face in her hands, made him look at her. Elvis, she'd said, her voice soft but steel underneath, let me tell you something about being different. When folks tell you you're too different, what they're really saying is that they're too limited to understand what you are. They can only see what already exists, what's already been done. But you, baby, you're seeing what could be. He hadn't understood it then, not really. But sitting in that parking lot with Logan's dismissal still ringing in his ears, it started to make sense. Logan could only see what music had been, not what it could become. He was an expert in yesterday's sound, yesterday's rules, yesterday's boxes. But Elvis, maybe Elvis was hearing tomorrow. The energy in the car changed, palpable as electricity before a storm. The sorrow was still there, would always be there in some form, but it was being overtaken by something else. Not quite rage, but close to it. A barely controlled anger at being dismissed, at being told he didn't fit, at being reduced to nothing by a man in a charcoal suit with a silver pocket watch. But more than anger, it was conviction. The absolute, unshakable belief that Logan was wrong. Not just wrong, but catastrophically, historically wrong. The kind of wrong that people would talk about decades later, shaking their heads at the short-sightedness of it all. Elvis started the car at 5:43. The drive back to Memphis would take 4 hours, but he wasn't going home, not yet. There was something his mama had said right after that speech about being different. Strong people, she'd told him, turn pain into power. Weak people let pain turn them into nothing. You get to choose which one you're going to be. He knew which one he was choosing. The tears were done. The self-pity was done. What remained was something harder, more focused. Logan had given him something without meaning to. He'd shown Elvis exactly what he was up against. Not just one man's opinion, but an entire industry's inability to see beyond what already existed. The funny thing about being told you're unmarketable is that it clarifies things. If you don't fit into any existing box, then maybe the answer isn't to try harder to fit. Maybe the answer is to build your own box, make it so compelling that everyone else has to adjust to you. Maybe being too different wasn't a weakness at all. Maybe it was the only advantage that actually mattered. 3 months later, December 18, 1954, 8:47 p.m., back at the Louisiana Hayride. The same auditorium, the same stage, but everything else had changed. In those 3 months, something had happened that Horace Logan, with all his expertise and authority, had failed to predict. A little recording called That's All Right had been released by Sun Records, a tiny Memphis label run by a man named Sam Phillips who understood something Logan didn't. That different wasn't a liability, it was the whole point. The record had exploded across the South like wildfire. Radio stations that weren't supposed to play it couldn't stop playing it. Teenagers that weren't supposed to like it were lining up outside record stores. The boxes that Logan had said Elvis didn't fit into were being shattered, reformed, made irrelevant. And now Elvis Presley was back. Not for an audition this time, but as a featured performer. The Louisiana Hayride, desperate to capture the phenomenon that was sweeping across the region, had booked him for a regular Saturday night slot. Logan hadn't made the decision. The station owners had, looking at the numbers, the requests, the undeniable evidence that something seismic was happening. Elvis walked onto that stage at exactly 8:52 p.m., wearing a pink shirt that would have gotten him laughed out of most venues just 6 months earlier. The pomade was gone, his hair falling naturally across his forehead. The nervousness was gone too, replaced by something that looked like destiny finally catching up with itself. The crowd, 3,000 strong, mostly teenagers, erupted before he even reached the microphone. And when he started to play, when those hips started moving, when that voice filled the auditorium, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted in the universe of American music. Logan was there standing in the wings, his silver pocket watch forgotten in his pocket. His face was a study in reluctant recognition, the expression of a man watching his own limitations exposed in real time. After the performance, as Elvis walked off stage to screams that shook the building's foundation, Logan approached him. The conversation was brief, witnessed by several stagehands who would tell the story for years afterward. "I was wrong," Logan said, the words seeming to physically pain him. "I was completely, utterly wrong." Elvis looked at him and there was no triumph in his expression, no gloating, just a kind of sad understanding. "No, sir," he said, his voice quiet enough that Logan had to lean in to hear it over the still screaming crowd. "You weren't wrong, you just couldn't see it. There's a difference." Logan's jaw tightened. "What I mean is, I was too limited to understand what you were doing. I could only see what had been, not what was coming." "That's the thing about being different, Mr. Logan," Elvis said, already moving past him, already leaving that moment behind. "It's only wrong until it's right, and then everyone pretends they saw it coming all along." The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but it would define both men for different reasons. For Logan, it was the moment he realized his expertise had boundaries, that knowing everything about what had been didn't mean you could recognize what was becoming. For Elvis, it was confirmation of what his mama had told him, that rejection isn't failure, it's just someone else's inability to see what you see in yourself. The crowd was still screaming, still calling for an encore. Elvis walked back out onto that stage, the same stage where he'd been destroyed 3 months earlier, and owned it completely. He wasn't operating at the outer edge of his ability, he was operating from a place beyond ability, from pure instinct and conviction. Every movement was both calculated and completely natural, every note both rehearsed and spontaneous. Margaret Whitfield was there too, standing next to Logan, her clipboard forgotten. Later, she would tell her daughter that watching Elvis that night was like watching the future arrive all at once, without warning or apology. "It was a masterclass," she said, "not in music, but in believing in yourself when no one else does." The Louisiana Hayride performance would become legendary, not because it was Elvis's best. He would have better nights, bigger stages, more historic moments. It became legendary because it was proof that the experts don't always know, that the authorities aren't always right, that sometimes being told you're too different is the best thing that can happen to you. It recalibrated the sense of what was possible, not just in music but in life. If a 19-year-old truck driver from Tupelo could transform American culture simply by refusing to fit into the existing boxes, then maybe all those boxes were more fragile than anyone realized. Maybe they were all just waiting for someone with enough conviction to kick them apart. The untold legacy of Elvis Presley isn't about the fame or the fortune or even the music, really. It's about that moment in the parking lot when a young man had to choose between accepting someone else's definition of his limitations or deciding to define them himself. It's about the 2 hours of tears that became a lifetime of determination. It's about understanding that when someone tells you to stick to truck driving, they're not really talking about your future. They're revealing their own inability to imagine it. Legends don't start as legends. They start as hopeful young people with dreams that seem too big, too different, too impossible. They start as 19-year-olds with $3.72 in their pockets and hands that shake when they hold their guitars. They start with people like Horace Logan telling them they're unmarketable, that they don't fit, that they should stick to safer, smaller dreams. But here's what Logan didn't understand, what the experts rarely understand. Being told you're too different isn't an ending, it's a beginning. It's the universe's way of telling you that you're about to change things, that the existing boxes can't hold what you're about to become. The pain of rejection isn't meant to stop you, it's meant to forge you into something strong enough to handle what comes next. Every person who's ever done something that mattered has had their Horace Logan moment, their parking lot breakdown, their 2 hours of believing it was over. The difference between those who become legends and those who don't isn't talent or luck or even determination. It's the ability to transform pain into power, to take the word unmarketable and hear unprecedented, to be told you're too different and understand that's exactly the point. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977, having sold over 500 million records worldwide, having fundamentally altered the trajectory of popular music, having proved that being too different wasn't a limitation but a superpower. But the real legacy, the untold one, lives in every person who's ever been rejected by an authority figure and chose to use that rejection as fuel rather than permission to quit. Strong people turn pain into power. Weak people let pain turn them into nothing. The choice, as Gladys Presley understood as her son learned in a parking lot in Shreveport, is always ours to make. The experts will always exist with their silver pocket watches and their leather notebooks and their absolute certainty about what's possible. But they can only define your limits if you let them. Have you ever been told you weren't good enough? What did you do to prove them wrong?